So again, just really quickly to introduce ourselves, I'm Sandra Valnes.
I'm Liliana Paredes.
And today we have the great pleasure of spending the evening with you talking about the webinar that we have entitled Translanguaging Corriente in the L2 Classroom, From Opportunities to Principled Practices. And so what we're going to talk about today is divided up into a few parts. First, we'd like to begin with a recap of the work that we've done over the past 2 semesters in piloting this project here at Duke. Which will then help us to transition to lessons learned, where we'll talk a little bit about how these pilot experiences have informed the work that we're doing around principled practices for translanguaging pedagogies in the L2 classroom. Once we've done that, we'll reflect a bit on the theoretical links between translanguaging and translocality before sharing briefly our planned future directions. And we're hoping to be able to have a chance to take some of your questions and comments at the end. So I'm going to begin with a recap. And for those of you who either attended the first webinar that we gave on this topic back in December of 2021, I think, or 2022, or were able to 2021, or were able to join us in Chicago last October, some of this will sound pretty familiar. But we thought that it was important, before we share the lessons learned and the practices developed, to speak a little bit about the origins of the project. So we think it's important to situate the evolution of our thinking on translanguaging pedagogies in the context of this work that we've already done. But first, a bit of a redefinition of translanguaging. Li Wei and Ofelia Garcia have defined translanguaging as, quote, new language practices that make visible the complexity of language exchanges among people with different histories, end quote. The theory was originally developed in bilingual classrooms and was meant to challenge the stark separations between named languages that isolated students' L1s from their L2s and created a deficit model of language acquisition. Translanguaging instead imagines language learning as an expansion and a deepening of individuals' linguistic repertoires to make meaning and communicate within and across named languages in community with others who in turn have their own unique linguistic repertoires. The image on the right, over here, is one visual representation of the translanguaging corriente, or the idea that linguistic repertoires are made up of all an individual's languages and bridge artificial gaps between named languages to make meaning in multilingual communities. We first experimented with the idea of using translanguaging pedagogies to help foster the creation of multilingual communities of learners in spring of 2022. We taught parallel sections of Spanish and French 111, which at our university is an intensive introductory course designed to cover the first year of college French or Spanish in a single semester. Mondays through Thursdays were normal class days in language, where the French students met in French class and the Spanish students met for Spanish class. We dubbed the Friday sessions Translanguaging Fridays, or TLF for short. And in these Friday sessions, all students met together for work that happened in and across all languages spoken or being learned by the group. During the 2 semesters we piloted this translanguaging pedagogical approach in Spanish and French 111, we've tested many different types of activities. These activities have included multilingual games, such as the bananagrams that you see over here, multilingual group activities that tasked students with working across languages to collaborate, discussions in English about language ideologies and multilingualism, which you see here, and activities such as visits to the museum on our campus or in outdoor spaces to interact with community guests. These sessions offered plenty of opportunities to explore a variety of approaches for translingual involvement and student engagement. During these sessions, Liliana and I learned many lessons about translanguaging pedagogical practice. In what follows, we'll first detail the key lessons learned and then move on to the principal practices that we draw from these lessons. So because the work was so collaborative, we spent a great deal of time reflecting individually and together on our and our students' experiences in the course.
So one of the first lessons learned is that students are our interlocutors in the process. So we engage with them to explain the what and the why are we doing what we're doing in the classroom. So in that way, they are our partners, and we plan our work accordingly to the conversations with them. So they are our interlocutors, and as such, they have a way to influence how we handle the classes, especially the TLFs on Fridays, And we do these conversations on both the theoretical component of why we're doing this, like translanguaging, a little bit of translanguaging theory and other theory that is important, but also how we implement or translate that into the activities that we do in the classroom, both in the languages, like in Spanish or French, but also during Fridays, For instance, we start a conversation with excerpts from a reading from Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa about additive and subtractive bilingualism and trying to reflect on that. And I'll explain that a little more later. And normally our students are not exposed to that kind of focus and conversations, but we want to foster that conversation so that students understand that they don't have to come to Friday just to have fun.
Great. The second lesson that we learned over the course of this 2-semester pilot is that students need well-scaffolded and well-explained and articulated structure. It's because so much of our work in this early pilot phase of the project was exploratory in nature. Initially, what happened in the Monday through Thursday in-language sessions provided the guiding structure of the course. So while Friday sessions were always intentionally planned and executed, as time progressed, we found that students' understanding of how the joint Fridays fit into our weekly rhythm, or how the theory and praxis of translanguaging fit into the overall arc and objectives of the course was less well developed than we'd hoped. So over time, we came to understand that students needed even more structure than what we had originally built into the course, and that structure needed to make explicit how translanguaging was not only a pedagogical approach, but indeed an ideological aspiration of the course.
Right. That was very important for us. And together with that comes the building community. So community doesn't build itself. And even though it might sound a little artificial, we plan Fridays as a practice to build communities of practice. And the communities of practice was a community of learners, students who learn both languages, students who are experiencing a process of vulnerability through language learning. So, but all of that had to be, again, planned and structured. Because of that, we added to that space some joyful activities, which is the next lesson learned. Like we cannot have a build community without joy. And the bananagrams, the going out in the community, the learning how to do papel picado, all of that many of us probably do in class anyways, were implemented in the classroom with the intentionality of building community. And we asked the students to reflect on those activities. So it wasn't just to have fun, but we asked questions like, what did playing bingo with your French colleague mean to you,
The final lesson that we'll mention here before we move on to the principled practices that we developed from these lessons was the idea of community beyond our classroom space. Because fostering multilingual communities of practice was such an integral part of the work that we engaged in during our Translanguaging Fridays, we learned that it was equally important to expand these communities beyond the classroom space. We'll talk more about what this meant in practice during our pilot course, and also what we look ahead to for ways in which we'd like to build upon this idea going forward. So from these lessons learned, we've begun to articulate what we're calling here principled practices for translanguaging pedagogy. But it's also often been said that translanguaging is not, in fact, a pedagogy, which we understand to mean that it is not a method that requires a prescribed set of techniques or a set curriculum. What we'll propose here is what we have found relevant for our context, and also an approach to centering translanguaging in a way that we hope is true to the spirit of the theory, even in a context that's very different from the ones in which translanguaging was originally developed and elaborated.
So the first principled practice, and I'm sure many of you already do this in your classes, because Sandy and I both were doing this before we started this project, but our first principal practice is to foster meta awareness in the classroom, and which is a reflection of what and how they're thinking of their own learning. So for us, meta awareness work is crucial. And as we introduce practice that is new to them, so we want them to reflect not only on how do you think you're handling the past tense or the present progressive, which we do. So it's meta linguistic awareness. We also ask them to reflect on how do you feel about joining work with your classmates in French. What do you have in common, and what is different for you? And then we also go to, when we talk about communities beyond the classroom, we talk about the multilingual communities around us. So this meta-awareness practice is important because we want students to start understanding that their process of learning a second language is a process of becoming members of a multilingual world, and in ways that are, well, it's hopeful for us that they understand also that the world is not monolingual, and they are not just adding one more language into the repertoire, but it's something else, what is going on. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. One of the, as part of this meta-awareness, we talk about, as I said before, we talk about additive bilingualism and subtractive bilingualism. And the question that we pose to the students is like, what does it mean for you? What learning a second language means to you? And most of the time they recognize and they are aware that they're adding a language and to the repertoire of language, either to English, if there are English speakers of English only, or to the other languages that they speak. And the reflection is, what is that experience compared to the experience of people who speak or who are bilingual already, but are members of a community that they don't belong to, you know, like society. And in this case, we're focusing on the minoritized communities, bilingual communities. And we ask this question, you know, why learning a language in college has a special social value in contrast to learning, speaking a language in society that has the impact of asking the community to become bilinguals of the majority language. And the expectation is that those people, the people who speak Spanish, for instance, learn English and move away from Spanish. So what is that difference? That reflection, the intention of having that reflection in the classroom has as a goal the need for us to have our students understand that there is two values of language learning, and the ones that they are facing in college is the adding a value of instrumentality, a value of commerce, and so on. But on the other hand, if somebody speaks a second language in community, that bilingualism is devalued. And by having this reflection, we want our students to understand how society works in terms of language learning and language speaking, especially in multilingual societies where some languages are discriminated against. Oh, okay. Another aspect of this meta-awareness is that we ask our students to keep journals and language acquisition journals or reflections. So we give them questions and they reflect on the process. And I'm sure many of you already practice reflections with your students, but we have an example here, you know, and the question is, first, reflect on your process of understanding, making meaning in languages that you are unfamiliar with, like French, Spanish, or Catalan. This is when we had a friend presenting in Catalan in our classroom. What strategies did you use? So this was very intentional. You know, we had a friend who was able to speak the 3 languages, and he presented in all those languages, and students were just listening. And some of the answers were very insightful as in terms of the awareness that the students are already using for their process of language understanding. And in this case, this student said that the 2 main strategies used were finding cognates and using context, environment, cues, numbers, nationalities, and so on. And once I realized I should not try to understand all the parts of the language, but instead just listen to these similar parts, it became much easier to understand. And for us, that is a key element of this process of understanding multiple languages that they are engaging with in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And the last one is another example of the same question. And the person responds, like, in my day-to-day life, the biggest change is that now I can speak to my mom in French. Though she isn't technically native, she lived there for a number of years. I don't know what there was, but
Paris.
Okay, Paris, and speaks like a native. Also, now I recognize more of the borrowed Romance languages words in English, which has made it easier to decipher new vocabulary in French for common Latin stems, which is another meta analysis, you know, of the process of what they're internalizing as they are learning the language.
Okay. So the second principled practice that we'd like to talk about is critical questions. And so we'll describe in the next slide our hope for these critical questions, which is that they drill down to the fundamental ideas that we hope to explore in our translanguaging courses, but also help our students embrace criticality in their development as multilingual individuals. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but very early in the planning project of this project, Liliana and I decided that we wanted to use a pair of Colette textbooks, so Proyectos in Spanish and Défi Francophone in French, that were similar not only in their style and approach, but also in their course content. However, over the course of the first semester of this pilot project, it became clear that these similarities alone were not enough to solidify the common threads that linked the Spanish and French courses to each other and to the joint Translanguaging Friday sessions. So for that reason, Liliana and I returned to the drawing board during the summer between the first and second iterations of the course to create an overarching structure that would lend more coherence to the course and emphasize both the linguistic and the dispositional and philosophical goals of the course. So we established a structure of 4 broad modules for the course: identity, spaces and places, language and community, each guided by what we originally termed essential questions, which you see here. We chose the topics based on common themes that would be relevant for the students, and these essential questions served as linguistic and thematic scaffolding for the in-language work happening in each individual module. And as the questions move from lists and descriptions early in the semester to more narrative and argumentative discursive structures as the semester progressed. However, since implementing them, our thinking about the role of these types of questions in framing and structuring the course has evolved. So we now think that it's useful to consider these questions as critical rather than essential questions. While we think this type of structure is essential in the sense of importance, what we want to frame by calling them critical questions is in fact the fact that we're interested in the criticality of them. So in the sense of giving students opportunities to think deeply and critically about questions at the intersections of language study and topics that matter to them. Importantly, this module structure and the guiding questions that accompanied it helped us to make explicit the links between the languages we were learning, our communities on campus and beyond, and students' growing or expanding multilingualism. As the students' linguistic repertoires grew to include the Spanish or French they were learning in class, their translanguaging corriente expanded. So for example, in the third final task of the semester, in which students traced their individual sociolinguistic history using maps and timelines and images and narratives, students leveraged all of their languages, English, French, or Spanish, as well as their other languages, to tell the stories of the languages that shaped their histories and identities. In the final task of this semester, multilingual groups of Spanish and French 111 students worked together to identify multilingual spaces on campus and to propose initiatives that would highlight the presence of those spaces for our broader campus community. By framing our time together, both in language and translingually, via these essential or rather critical questions, students were able to better understand how the beginning level language they were learning allowed them to tackle complex and meaningful questions, how the course content informed larger considerations of identity and of community, and how the weekly translanguaging sessions fit into the broader goals of the course. This framing also sort of avoids the framing of an implicit deficit model, which for the vast majority of our language learning students tends to be a stumbling block for what they're trying to do as they learn a language.
So the principal practice number 3 is assessing what matters. And here we're still developing our practices, but I think Sandy and I have reached this conclusion. We need to assess what matters. And I know that sometimes assessment translates into grading, right? And to giving a grade or to correcting errors. And one of the reflections that we have with our students is, what is the role of errors in our language learning process? And of course, errors are a source of vulnerability for language learners. It is a source of avoidance of risk-taking, like they try to be simple. And what we wanted for them is to loosen up that kind of vulnerability and feel welcome to make mistakes. And so one of the first conversations we have is like in our classes separately, like in language, is like, okay, so what are errors, and can we change the term of errors and think of them as something different, that happens no matter what. And some of the terminology that they came with was adjustments. And so instead of corrections, they wanted to refer to the changes they needed to make as adjustments of language, because they saw errors as a natural part of the production of their own productions, and whatever didn't work needed an adjustment, not a correction. So changing the language and our approach to how to name things had the goal of helping the students become more comfortable with the process of language learning. In terms of assessing what matters also, we had a reflection of grading practices. And although we are not there yet, we are planning to implement. So we can show first what we were doing for the TLF work. And it was, we had Translanguaging Fridays, had a 15% of the final grade was based on what we did on those Fridays, or 30%. And so we had reflections and we gave percentage, but most of the work that they did was pass satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And so if they didn't do it, they didn't get the satisfactory. So it was like done or not done. I think we want to structure this practice a little more next time we do it. And we will create yet another space of ungrading practices, by which we're planning to call it the zone of no grading, where students will have a space to be creative, a space to make mistakes, and space that we will give them feedback, but that they will not be affected, by a negative result. And then we will have a zone of pass-fail, or SU, if you want, where the focus is going to be on strong feedback from us. But if they turn in something, we will just focus on the feedback, and it's going to be pass. And there's not going to be a discount of points based on errors or even adjustments, right? And then we're going to do graded work, which is probably going to be the final tasks for our modules. Okay, so the fourth principle is building multilingual communities. So we have learned that the intentionality of our project had the goal. One of the important goals was rather ideological. We wanted to emphasize to our students how the world was multilingual, and we've repeated this a couple of times already here, but how do we translate that into a language class? How do we translate that into an elementary level language class? And I think one of them is building this multilingual community. First, connecting our students, both in French and Spanish, on a specific day, doing activities, reflecting, and also making them understand and see that they could use their language resources, both in French and Spanish, in collaboration, and using also the same intellectual level that they have as college students. You know, many times students in elementary classes feel disengaged with the language learning part because they feel like they cannot express their what they really think. So we wanted to address all of that by building these multilingual communities. And at the same time, I think we're playing with this concept of translocality as a reflection of translanguaging practices that connect with the description of what Ofelia Garcia did for New York and bilingual education. But we understand that we're looking at our students from a different perspective. The translanguaging that practice that we are trying to implement here is connected to the students who are the learners who are, or the speakers, if you want, that are more privileged in terms of their bilingualism. So why translocality? Translocality is a concept like that is equivalent to globalization, but it's seen from the South. You know, with globalization, we talk about the movement of ideas, people, cultures, objects, products, and so on in a positive way. But when we talk about migration, and for instance, you know, or other type of movements, especially from the global South, we don't see them as valuable as the other movements that are described as global. So by understanding this concept of translocality, we are hoping that we can focus also on the communities at large that our students are going to be connecting with, you know, in beyond Duke, you know, as French speakers, speakers of Creole or other language of Francophone speakers, as well as Spanish speakers. And in that sense, we're trying to have them understand that once again, that by recognizing those speakers as valuable as so those languages that these people speak as valuable as the languages they're learning, we are hoping that they will feel a sense of belonging to that multilingual community. So I think we have a reflection from one of our students that connects to this idea, because this student was a speaker of several languages. She was, what was her country? I don't remember, but she reflected her multilingualism on this image that you can see now on the screen. And she said, well, I have my global identity because she learned Latin and she was learning French. And then her local identity was English, you know, in the center, but connecting with these other languages that she was learning. And then she said my local identity with the native languages that she was able to understand and speak. By understanding translocality, and we would propose this student that maybe we can make a 3 circles in connection and having translanguaging and translocality in the center, you know, because all these languages that moved with her and with her family to the US can be seen in that center as interacting in themselves, in their own identities. And is that mine too? Okay, so by building community, and this is we have two pictures here where our students, our class was early in the morning, 8:30 in the morning, and this was a very cold October. And we invited a friend of us from Durham to work with our students to make papel picado in the context of El Día de los Muertos. So I know that El Día de los Muertos is a very, it can be a very stereotypical thing to talk about and to do in a class. But in this event, what we tried was to connect the making the papel picado with being out in nature. We were at the gardens here on campus, and we gave students the task of finding a connection with nature in groups of French, Spanish students, and to later come and share with us and then learn to make papel picado. So building community has to be intentional, and it has to be an understanding of how these practices that we have here, like making papel picado, celebrating Dia de los Muertos, because our friend Ivan, who ran this workshop of making papel picado, he creates a big festivity of Dia de los Muertos as part of Durham, of celebration in Durham. So it's not that we are appropriating Dia de los Muertos. It is like Dia de los Muertos is in Durham as well, and it's one example of the trans that we're talking about, translanguaging and translocality as well.
Okay. So I think what we wanted to do now was talk a little bit about future directions and how we are working to continue to develop this project going forward, both in the context that we've described and also in other contexts. So as we look ahead to next steps, we're committed to expanding our students' interactions with multilingual communities. And as researchers and pedagogues, the two of us look forward to considering what a translanguaging pedagogical praxis may look like for learners with more awareness of the languages they're studying. So to that end, our immediate next steps include a new pilot of our translanguaging teaching model, this time in an intermediate level third semester French and Spanish pair of courses. So into this course, we hope to incorporate an intensive experiential learning component via an alternative spring break trip someplace outside of Durham. There, we hope to interface with Spanish-speaking communities and are hoping to be able to travel to Louisiana. In addition to interfacing with Spanish-speaking communities, we are also hoping to learn from the work of cultural anthropologists and linguists at Tulane, who are actively studying the connections between language and sustainability, and minority language loss or preservation, and coastal land loss and preservation. So we also look forward to extended engagements with meaning making of and potential of working across French, Spanish, and English in order to do this. This will include comparative linguistic work via expanded study of narrative genres such as graphic novels in language and across languages in translation. We also plan to involve students more deeply with the concept of translanguaging in order to make more explicit connections between lived multilingual experience and the theory and praxis of translanguaging. Our final goal for our continuing work hopes to interface more explicitly with the connections translanguaging and translocality have on institutions and on policies. So we plan to continue our reimagining of translanguaging in ways that give us a way to move away from a model of language learning that focuses on deficits. And a desired implication of this work is to use our experiences with translanguaging pedagogies in language learning to collaborate in a reframing of how language learning is thought of in higher education contexts. The final thing that we wanted to mention, it's our understanding that you will perhaps be receiving copies of the slides, and if not, even perhaps a link. At the end of last semester, one of our colleagues was able to visit our course and to do a little mini documentary of the work that students were doing. And I think that one of the things that Liliana and I find both really engaging and really inspiring about this work is how well and how thoughtfully our students spoke about their work in class. Many of them talked about the personal connections that they were making, not only with the language they were studying, but also with each other. And many of them also spoke about the space as a sense of community and of safety, which was one of our top priorities in thinking together about what we wanted our classroom space to look like. So hopefully this will be something that you're able to watch a little bit later on if you're interested. And with that, I think that we'll extend our thanks. We've got a little bit of extra time, and so would welcome questions or comments and a conversation.
Once again, I'd like to remind everyone that you're free to post all your questions in the Q&A. We will see those shortly. And before, I'd like to mention two things. Firstly, we're gonna put right in the chat a form. So if you'd like to receive a certificate for this, a certificate of attendance for this webinar, then you just need to fill that out, put your complete email, and we'll send that to you with the presentation and with everything else. And I'd also like to mention that this topic is also part of Honing Our Craft, which is our new book. And I'd like to take a few minutes and give you some more information before we go to the Q&A. So yes, Honing Our Craft, this is our new material, which is written by educators and it's for educators. The idea of this manual is that it's a collection which is useful for teachers, which answer many of the questions that you may have regarding several topics, from didactics itself, how to incorporate social justice, and more topics that we're going to see in a few seconds. It has 12 chapters and it shows many topics which are discussed in our professional community. We have many amazing writers, collaborators, and the editors of this book are Florencia Henshaw and Kim Potowski. Then here, as you can see, are some of the contents of the book. As you can see, Translanguaging is actually there on chapter 11, but we also have many other things such as multiliteracy pedagogy. We have comprehension-based communicative language teaching, We also have social justice-oriented curriculum. We have community. We have many topics which we believe will be very useful for all of you. Just so you know, we are also collaborating with the California Language Teaching Association, and we're actually having a book club for Honing Our Craft with monthly meetings. This is everyone's invited. This is actually free for state or regional World Language Association members, but all of you are more than invited. And there is a special discount for the attendees of the book club. There is another few discounts I'm going to mention, so don't worry if you cannot join. Then, just so you know, Honing Our Craft is also the name for our conference. This is the second year that we're hosting it. It will be on the 7th and 8th of October, so it's pretty close. And it's a hybrid event, so it's in person in Chicago, and if you cannot go, no worries, because you can always attend online, and you'll have all the recordings for 6 months. We also have a pre-event on AI and world languages. We're having 4 plenary sessions, 6 workshops, a chance to win $200, which maybe you can go on our website and find more information. It's a really interesting contest, which you can participate in. And about the discounts I mentioned, we have a 20% off on Honing Our Craft. You just need to put that code, HOC book, and you'll get that 20% off. And I think we can go for the Q&A. So, are you ready, first of all?
We are ready.
Fantastic. So, our first question is if the students knew about the Friday sessions when they enroll in your class.
Yes, but so yes, in theory they did. It was pretty well presented as a part of the course description as students were enrolling. The first time that we taught it, I think we had a couple of students who were perhaps surprised by the fact that there was this modality. But by the second time we taught it, I think that all students had expected it, and so knew. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. So we know the reaction of your students, but someone asked about the reaction of your colleagues with these Friday sessions as well.
You want to field that one?
Well, I think our colleagues are excited for the project and are hoping to see some of the results of what we're trying to do. We know that this model cannot probably be expanded to all language courses, but many of our colleagues are supportive of what we're doing. And so far we've had very positive conversations with them instead of a confrontation or conflict, you know.
And many of our colleagues are also really interested and actively invested in this work and are doing interesting things with translanguaging and multilingualism in their own courses. And so I think that it aligns itself pretty nicely with a lot of work that colleagues are doing. Yeah.
Fantastic. So another question we have is if it would be possible to know again the course in which you conducted this intervention.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that. Yeah. So the course is actually really interesting and unique. And because of its uniqueness, I think that we had a lot of flexibility that might not necessarily be the case in other programs with multiple sections of the same course. So the course that we taught is coded 111, which in our context is a combination of 101 and 102 combined. So it's essentially 1 year of college French or Spanish in a single semester. Because of this, it's really intensive. It meets for 95 minutes 5 days a week. And it is also the only section of the course that's taught. So Liliana and I essentially have complete freedom to do what we want because we're not trying to map our work onto work that's being done in other multiple sections of the same course.
But that said, I mean, the Spanish 111 or French 111 have the same goals and outcomes for 101 and 102, which are the regular courses in our own languages. So we were not completely disengaged of what the language programs were doing in that sense.
Our students still need to be prepared for the next course in sequence. Yes.
Fantastic. And actually on that same line, someone mentions that usually a certain language proficiency is the goal for the students in a college language classroom. So they ask if the students still achieve that certain proficiency and if the Fridays usually have been more regular language classes.
You want to start?
You can start.
Oh, I can start. Okay. So this is actually a really good question. And I think that's something that Liliana and I have spoken a lot about because packed into that question, it's a really well-worded question, I think, are some of the ideologies that we're trying to push against. But yes, to answer your question, since students do need to be able to take the next course in sequence, the idea is that they are achieving essentially similar levels of proficiency to what students exiting Spanish 102 or French 102 would have. That said, I think a lot of the work that we're trying to do in this course is to unpack the idea that anything less than perfect native like Spanish or French is somehow deficient or less than. And trying to challenge the idea that this end goal, sort of like this native like proficiency, is the only valid end goal, I think, for language study.
So one of the things that we're trying to do is to debunk some myths, the first one being like the world is monolingual, and also that they're learning the language, Spanish or French or even any other language, is an isolated enterprise. Is an isolated event, because they're part of other groups of students who are learning for the first time a language or for the second time, but facing that experience, right? And in that sense, the other myth that we're trying to debunk is the myth of perfect proficiency, and that's why we are treating errors as natural things to happen when we're learning language, and in association with that, we're thinking of practices of UNgrading to relax students to be able to take risks, as we said, and also as Sandy was saying, we want them to imagine a language use, the use of language as not as a deficient process because they haven't reached certain native like. Well, in 2 semesters, they will never try to do that, but we want them to feel that they are prepared for the next level, and regardless the understanding that the errors and that they are producing are part of the language process, the learning process.
Yeah, I think maybe coming back to the question of communities of practice, because you spoke a lot about communities of practice, and I think that there can be ideas of proficiency that can be based more on participation in communities and less on some sort of objective model of what proficiency looks like or sounds like. And so the idea that developing more proficiency in a language allows you to participate more and more completely in a wider variety of multilingual communities, I think has helped at least me to sort of think about where ideas of proficiency might slot into this pedagogical model.
Right. And also connecting with communities beyond the classroom, it has shown us that students are trying to use the language level. I mean, I remember when we had the speaker, Adam, to talk about his own experience. Every speaker that we have in the classroom is a multilingual speaker. And every guest that we have had in the classroom has been a multilingual guest. So they share their story of becoming multilingual and the story of not being able to communicate and as a natural process of language learning. And then they do the presentation in the language, right? That's what, in Translanguaging actually. So students also see their proficiency as a process, and not as an end product of the level. And I mean, I haven't talked to my colleagues who taught them in 2 or 3, so that would be a good conversation to have. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. That's an interesting question, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We have a few more actually. So this person, firstly, congratulates you both. And then the question would be if you think that using translanguaging in high school class would differ from a university class, and if so, in which aspects?
Totally. This is right up your alley with your work with DPS, I think. Or not, sorry.
Oh, yeah. We did something. No, I mean, I think I don't have experience teaching in high school. So and translanguaging, when translanguaging as a practice in high school by Ofelia Garcia was, proposed, it was with the idea of exactly working with the language resources that students have in the classroom as a valuable resource, and not as a deficient reality. What in my knowledge of high school is very limited, and I would say that many teachers would have a lot of restrictions on how they will implement a project like ours in the classroom, and also I'm not sure if students at that age, depending on the level, if they will be develop enough their cognition, to understand what like the meta practice that we're planning, that we do in our classes. So translanguaging, so I don't have an answer for Rob. Hi, Rob. I don't have an answer for you in that sense, because I don't know high school enough to see if this will work or not. And I would say probably in a private school, you can practice this, you can implement something like this. Yeah, I don't know, Sandy, you have an idea?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would just apologize that my knowledge of high school is pretty limited. Yeah, I think that I would echo that. I know that there are constraints and expectations, especially programs that are aligned with, for example, AP or IB standards. I think it might take some creativity to figure out how to make it work, while also trying to fit in all the content that is involved in preparing students for a big sort of final assessment via AP or IB exams.
At the same time, I would say, like, I have experience working with public school teachers. I mean, not necessarily high school, and they are very interested and decide they have a big desire of addressing language justice in the classroom. And for us, translanguaging is what we do in the classroom is one way to emphasize the need of linguistic justice in the world in general. I mean, that's very aspirational. But language teachers public school teachers that I've been working with another project that we have a group of people have here, are really in big desire to address issues of language and language discrimination. So it will be interesting to see if these teachers, if they will be willing to implement some translanguaging practices, assuming that they have all the resources as well. Yeah, but
fantastic. Another question would be, maybe if we could know the assessment instruments that were used during the course, which language assessment instruments were used?
So in a lot of ways, the work that happened in Mondays through Thursdays in the in-language classes looked a lot like what a standard class would look like. So students were still expected to be able to demonstrate understanding of sort of target functions, target structures. In Translanguaging Fridays, we used assessment models that were designed to be a lot more collaborative and that were designed to have a variety of entry points and modes of sort of completion or finishing the task that would allow students to be thoughtful and also creative in their language use.
So yeah, I would say that our classes were very similar, like the language component of the classes were very similar, and we did a lot of task-based learning, project-based learning, and also we did quizzes, you know, like we had quizzes, and they were like very formative type of assessments. But on Fridays, we focus on tasks and projects in both languages. So we don't have an example here, but they produced presentations in both languages. They took turns, of course. We were not expecting my students to do some in French, but they collaborated in English most of the time, but they created the presentation in both languages. And that was and then they had a reflection. So we implemented reflections as a mandate for the Friday work. A mandate.
Right. But as an integral part of the work that they're doing, right? Yeah. I think that in trying to be thoughtful and a little bit meta about language learning and what language learning means, I think that it was also really important that students take a step back and articulate at several points over the course of the semester what they were doing, how they were doing it, and how their understanding of language learning and multilingualism and being a multilingual individual was developing.
Yeah.
So.
Great. Then another question we have is if students took a placement test if they taken a placement test to determine their level and the content.
So this was for beginners. So the placement test was, have you had any French before or any Spanish before? The vast majority of the students had no French before.
No, in Spanish is different, as you can imagine. I mean, many students had already had some Spanish in high school, so the cutoff number of years of experience was 1, I think.
Yeah.
If they had more than 1, or maybe in some cases 2, depending, because they always have some qualifications of the language learning before coming to class, to our classes. So, but in my class, I had students with some Spanish, some with 0 Spanish, and then I had students who were whose family spoke Spanish, but they themselves didn't have that ability. And yeah, so that's so no placement test.
Right. I think that the course does tend to be pretty self-selecting in that if you're going to sign up to do something for 95 minutes, 5 days a week at 8:30 in the morning, it needs to be something that you're, at least in our context, that you're pretty interested in. And a lot of times it tends to be students who have had experiences with other languages. And so in my class, this last semester that we taught it together, I had, I think, 3 or 4 students who had never studied French, but who either spoke or had studied a great deal of Spanish, for example.
Yeah, and at some point we exchanged students.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
They enroll in Spanish, and then they learn about Sandy's class, and they say, oh, we're gonna see each other anyways, but I'm gonna go take French. You know, so
right.
We can only do that for 2 weeks into a semester. So
right.
Yeah.
Really amazing. Keeping up with the profile of the students, someone asks if you had any future teachers or linguists among the students, or spark that for anyone.
I actually had a student who was doing a program in education, and in the last time around. So one of her reflections, because she wants to be a teacher, and for her this understanding of multilingualism had never occurred, you know, to her. And one of her reflections at the beginning of the semester was, when I leave the classroom and I'm outside, my head is hurting, you know, like I have a big headache. but now I can pay attention to the languages that are spoken on campus that I never that never checked before, you know. So I don't think we had any linguists. Did you have any linguists?
We did have a couple of students who did very linguistics heavy final projects. We had a student who did a massive final project on comparative phonetics, which was pretty interesting, given that they'd never had any linguistics before. Yeah, I don't know that we necessarily have students who take from this experience then a desire to sort of switch their majors to linguistics.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so far, this is the last question. Let's see if something else comes up. This is a very interesting questions deals with demotivated students. So this is in the chat. The person mentions that they have been teaching Spanish at college level for 15 years, but that in the last 5 years, with technology especially, they have been struggling with motivating students. Of course, they find students who find English speakers wherever they go, and maybe they use their phones to communicate. So the question is if you think that translanguaging has a potential to actually motivate students, especially American students, the current generation, if even one language seems to be unnecessary for so many.
That's a very interesting question, because I would say if why do you think students are unmotivated? You know, like one of the questions that we have when we get students in our class, especially in Spanish, I don't know if it's the same for French, but I imagine there is some differences. Is like the requirement to be in a language class, and many times that requirement unmotivates students to take the class. They either postpone it to the very end, and by the time they take it, they're like they want to be out of it, you know, and they don't have the engagement that we expect them to have. So I'm not sure. I mean, to be honest, when we presented the translanguaging project to our students, they didn't have a choice. I mean, to be very honest, I mean, they were already enrolled. They knew that Fridays were going to be used with a project, but the result, I mean, if you are able to see the video at the very end, you can hear what some of the students say. And in our previous iteration of the class, our students presented in a conference. So I would say that don't expect to do a translanguaging project in your class as a way to motivate the students. I think it should be the other way around. I think what motivates students is to be part of a community. And if you create a community in your classroom, either with translanguaging or not, that might work more than I don't know, importing a project that might not feel organic to your class. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that answer. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yep, so far that was the last question. So once again, a really big thank you to both of you. This was an amazing time. I think everyone is going home with a lot of amazing insights. And thank you everyone also for joining us this afternoon. Please, if you have any questions that maybe come up after we close the webinar, remember that you can send us an email to marketing@cletwl.com, and you can send us the questions and we're going to send them to the speakers, to Liliana and Sandra. Also, our next webinar, just if you want to know, is on next Tuesday, September 26th, and it's called Experiential Learning in the World Language Classroom. We hope to see you there. You have the Eventbrite link in there. And yeah, basically just have a nice evening and enjoy. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.